So there is an out-of-print book that has been exploding in popularity right now in China. The book is called America Against America, and some copies of the book have surged to over $2,500 a copy. This is because the book is out of print and there's a renewed demand to get it. The book came out about 30 years ago, and it basically forecast the decline of the United States due to domestic and internal conflicts and strife. And I worry this book could be a harbinger for things to come, and I am a little bit worried about the future of the United States. So, hey, what's up, everybody? Alex Kapitko here. This will be the first catching up segment of the new year, and I know it's been a strange new year already, but I hope everyone's just staying as sane and healthy as they can be. So I want to talk about this book, America Against America, because, it's been out of print for years, but it's just become super popular again, mainly after the storming of the Capitol last week. I first came across this story in Bloomberg maybe a couple days ago, and I just kind of wanted to look into it more. So I'm going to keep this episode relatively short, but I think it's some serious things to talk about, even if it's a trend outside of the US and in China, because I think it tells what the world is thinking about the United States right now, and to be honest, it's not great. So the author of this book is Wang Huning, and I excuse my pronunciation, and he was the Communist Party's number 5 guy, and he was a top political theorist to 3 Chinese presidents. And so right off the bat, we know he's going to have a biased Chinese-scoped opinion on this, but I don't think that really matters in this case because that's not the point. He made some interesting outsider claims about the future of the U.S., and some of them do seem to be coming true. So Wang Wen, who is the dean of Renmin University's Institute for Financial Studies, says that, in quotes, "The interest in this book is the result of a renewed desire to understand a U.S. that is in the midst of a civil Cold War." Yes, a civil Cold War, and I think that's a pretty accurate term in a lot of ways to kind of describe where we're at. And according to Bloomberg, Wang Huning's book, which was written during an academic visit to the United States in 1988, predicted that America's emphasis on individualism, hedonism, and democracy would eventually cause rifts, division, and eventually kind of collapse. And he argued that collectivism, selflessness, and authoritarianism were the solution. Now, I don't agree with that second part, but it is interesting that in the 80s, he already saw this kind of growing class division, this growing individualism that could be detrimental. And I think that's something worth noting, even if you disagree with his remedies like authoritarianism. So my first take is, this is something that Drew and I have actually talked about a little bit, kind of the flaws of democracy. Not to say that democracy is not good, but there are flaws, like anything. And it seems that democracy can only go so far when people basically get into their own bubbles, when people get too polarized, when people start getting different information, and we can't agree on what is right or wrong, real or false, you know what I mean? And I think that's kind of where the U.S. is right now. I think it's an astute point about how the U.S. really is in something of kind of a cultural Cold War or a cultural civil war. The U.S. is factionalized, and it looks like China saw this coming. And so I just like seeing these perspectives because it really shows what the world's thinking of us. When this book was released, the U.S. had 2 rivals, right, which were Japan and the Soviet Union. One collapsed, the Soviet Union, and the other kind of stagnated. Japan did not have a great 90s. This left the U.S. with kind of a strong economy, huge military, but no purpose, right? For the first time, we weren't fighting an enemy. And I truly believe that because we had no common goal or enemy, we kind of slowly turned on each other through hyperpolarization, media, dogmatic leaders, populism. And I can imagine that Chinese officials see the U.S.'s COVID response, the transition chaos, storming the Capitol, the racial justice protests, when Trump and his guys, tear gas those peaceful protesters. They've seen the QAnon conspiracies, gun violence. And I think China's just looking at, oh my God, this country's going nuts inside, And it's worrying because China doesn't particularly see us as a threat. They kind of seem to see us as a waning world power. And I think they're going to be able to mobilize this anti-democratic messaging because they can now basically say, look at the U.S. Democracy clearly doesn't work there. So I don't think it's good for the world, and it's definitely not good for the U.S., but this is good for China, and it seems like they've predicted it. And now, other than that, there's another reason why the book is interesting. It's because it highlights China's goals and why over time the U.S. may not be a good partner to work with. The book talks about, why China may be hesitant to trust the U.S. Basically, the point is they're in it for the long game, and the U.S. is so divided that every 4 years there's radical change in foreign policy. So there's no trust. You can't guarantee that they're going to stay to their 4 years ago word. Every administration seems to bring radical change, and it's really hard to create a stable world order when that happens. And now I think that's kind of new, the fact that we have such a pendulum shift, And this is problematic for a country like China, who's in for the long game. Even if it's nefarious stability, I think it's just not good for China. And Bloomberg says that the Capitol Hill turmoil is being read in Beijing as the most powerful sign yet that the societal fissures in the U.S. are being increasingly erratic, and they're making foreign policy shifts. And I don't think this is good over the long term, because it's going to isolate the U.S. from China, and this decoupling really could be bad for both. Also, there's a quote from Wang Huning. He was that guy for the Financial Institute from earlier. And he says in quotes, "The instability of a negotiation partner means that its public credibility is on the decline, and the risk of breaking contracts or promises is greater." So, if the house isn't clean from the inside, people aren't really going to trust it, and I think that's what's happening. There's so much internal chaos that the world knows that there's no way we're going to be a good partner on the world stage. And so now, as the U.S. is truly in some form of a cold civil war, China knows that their time is coming. Right before the new year, China actually signed a very controversial investment deal with the EU. There's a good article in The Diplomat about this deal, but basically on December 30th of 2020, the EU and China concluded the negotiations of their Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is called the CAI. And the deal was going to basically broaden European companies' access to Chinese markets inside of China, and it's going to streamline the country's regulatory companies and environment, basically. And so, in a nutshell, it's basically bringing China and the EU closer together. And I won't get too much into this deal right now, just because there's many critiques, especially because the EU didn't really push for human rights violations by China. But this deal is big because it's showing how China is readjusting their practices to appeal to more Western democracies. And it could be a harbinger for things to come, because even Angela Merkel has applauded the deal. And the Diplomat thinks that this could be the beginning of a new normal for China and the EU to work together. So if you're in Biden's administration, this is scary. Trump's kind of radically changed our relationship with China, and now you're kind of seeing other countries, including the EU, go, maybe the U.S. aren't as reliable anymore. So I just think it's going to be really tough for the Biden administration. Even if they want to create more stability, it's almost like stability could be too late. And not even China, but the EU is seeing that too. You know what I mean? And lastly, the thing is, there's the trade war, right? There's a guy named Mei Jinyu who was with a research group under the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing. And he said, in quotes, "While both sides have paid a price for the trade war, the U.S. will suffer more in the long run because it's damaged its position and reputation as a central pillar of global trade and commerce." And this is probably correct, because the bigger issue for the U.S. is that we're internally divided, and our image on a global scale, that soft power, that light shining on top of the hill, we're no longer that. So this just kind of brings me to think that I guess all empires or world powers fade. They all have a shelf life. And, Drew and I have talked about Thucydides' trap as well, where, you have a waning power and a growing power, and we've talked about that with China before. I think that's relevant here. And I know some people laugh off what happened last week, saying that these were not terrorists that stormed the Capitol. They were just struggling conspiracy theorists with not much going on for them in their lives and no organization. Maybe that's true, but a country doesn't collapse overnight. And I think a lot of the world is watching this frog in boiling water, slowly waning. And China may flourish off of this. So yeah, that's a rosy episode for you guys. We'll be back next week, and have a great weekend. And let's try to all come together so maybe we don't go to the twilight like I'm worried we are. Take care.